They say modern wars are fought with missiles, but what if the next world war is triggered by an Excel spreadsheet crashing? Welcome back to What If Horizons, where today's news is just tomorrow's nightmare fuel. This week, we continue our journey into the rapidly escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. Now, if you missed last week's episode, congratulations on preserving your blood pressure. Israel's Operation Rising Lion was not just another cross-border skirmish. It was one of the most ambitious preemptive strikes in modern Middle Eastern history. Think surgical airstrikes, covert drone assassinations, entire nuclear facilities turned into piles of radioactive confetti. Basically, the Middle East version of a season finale cliffhanger. Naturally, Iran didn't take kindly to this. They responded with a swarm of missiles, drones, and all the fury you'd expect from a regime that just had its nuclear ambitions carpet-bombed. Israel's Iron Dome, David's Sling, and a few helpful American air defense units managed to intercept most of the incoming hardware, but not all. Some Iranian missiles slipped through, hitting civilian areas and pushing the region closer to the brink of a larger war. And now the world waits. Everyone's holding their breath, clutching their oil stocks, and furiously refreshing Twitter. But here's where things get really interesting and terrifying. Iranian officials are now hinting that their next move may not involve more conventional missile salvos. Now, they're talking about something far more creative, far more asymmetrical, and far, far messier. What if Iran's retaliation doesn't come from the sky, but from invisible code and radioactive dust? What if Tehran decides to strike back with dirty bombs and catastrophic cyberattacks? That's today's nightmare scenario, and as usual, we're going to dive headfirst into the abyss together.
Let's set the scene, because no good geopolitical panic attack begins without context. Just last week, the world witnessed Israel launch one of the most aggressive military operations in its history, Operation Rising Lion. Not exactly a subtle name. This wasn't a targeted drone here or a bunker buster there. This was a full symphony of destruction aimed at crippling Iran's nuclear dreams and its Revolutionary Guard reality. Over the course of 96 hours, Israel's Air Force, cyber units, and some deeply unacknowledged Mossad friends delivered destruction to over 100 high-value Iranian targets. Natanz hit. Fordow scrambled. IRGC command centers flattened. Several nuclear scientists reportedly disappeared, either into the ground or into new identities somewhere far less radioactive. Iran, unsurprisingly, responded. It launched a barrage of ballistic and cruise missiles alongside an army of drones toward Israeli territory. Israel's high-tech air defense network, backed by the U.S., intercepted most of them. Still, some got through, hitting civilian centers and killing innocents. So now the conflict sits on a knife's edge. The Israeli strike was unprecedented, but Iran's next move may define this era of conflict. And here's where things get disturbing. Iranian officials aren't talking about standard retaliation. They're talking about unimaginable responses. And in the world of strategic euphemisms, unimaginable usually means, oh, it's gonna be real bad. That's where two frightening terms start showing up in the conversations of security analysts, think tankers, and over-caffeinated journalists: dirty bombs and cyberwarfare. Now, these aren't entirely new threats. We've talked about them in hypotheticals for decades, but never in such a volatile, real-world context with a state actor like Iran under extreme pressure and very little left to lose. So let's break them down, starting with the one that involves radiation, panic, and a sprinkle of mass hysteria: dirty bombs. What exactly are they? What would happen if one detonated in a city like Tel Aviv, or worse, Dubai, London, or New York? And just how easy would it be for Iran or one of its well-funded, enthusiastic proxy groups to build and deploy one?
Let's talk about dirty bombs, the terrifying cousin of nuclear bombs that doesn't get nearly enough press, mostly because even journalists get queasy when thinking about them. Unlike the sophisticated, complex engineering feat that is a nuclear warhead, involving things like uranium enrichment, precision detonation sequences, and physicists who can spell plutonium backwards, a dirty bomb is refreshingly simple in the most horrifying way. Here's the recipe. Take one standard conventional explosive, like a suitcase bomb or a small car bomb. Now, generously sprinkle it with radioactive material, the kind that's not that hard to get if you happen to be, say, a government running a sprawling nuclear program, dozens of medical facilities, and industrial plants that handle radioactive isotopes every day. When the bomb explodes, most people nearby are harmed or killed by the conventional blast. But then comes the real problem. Radioactive dust and particles get dispersed into the surrounding environment, invisible, insidious, and persistent. The actual death toll may not be massive immediately, but the psychological, economic, and long-term health effects could be devastating. The target of a dirty bomb isn't a building, it's a society's sense of safety. Now, let's apply this to Iran. Iran has spent years building up not just uranium enrichment capacity, but also stockpiling medical isotopes, industrial radiological sources, and other fun little elements that glow ominously under the right lighting. Even after Israel's strikes crippled much of the formal nuclear infrastructure, Iran likely still retains enough radioactive material, directly or indirectly, to cobble together dirty bomb devices. And here's where things get unsettling. Constructing a dirty bomb is vastly easier than building a nuclear warhead. You don't need advanced centrifuges or highly enriched uranium. You just need basic explosives, some radioactive material, and a delivery system, which could be as simple as a cargo ship, a truck, or a proxy operative slipping across a border. Now imagine this scenario. A Hezbollah-linked terror cell, supplied and directed by IRGC elements, manages to plant a dirty bomb in downtown Tel Aviv, or maybe in Haifa. Or, if they really want to make global headlines, an international city like Dubai, London, or even New York. The conventional blast might kill dozens, maybe hundreds depending on the location. But that's just Act 1. Act 2 is where the chaos begins. Entire neighborhoods evacuated, massive contamination zones cordoned off for years, financial districts shuttered, markets plummet, air travel collapses as fear spreads globally. Hospitals are overwhelmed, not necessarily from radiation sickness, but from mass panic, people flooding in demanding screenings, terrified they've been exposed. Insurance markets? Frozen. Real estate? Wiped out. Governments declaring national emergencies. And here's the most insidious part, the psychological warfare. Dirty bombs don't need to kill millions to be effective. They just need to make millions feel unsafe. Now, let's really lean into the nightmare. What if Iran deploys not one dirty bomb, but several? Coordinated detonations in multiple cities, each carefully chosen to create maximum global disruption. You're not just looking at a terror attack. You're looking at global paralysis. Airports shut down, borders sealed, emergency responders stretched beyond breaking, civil liberties suspended as governments scramble to restore order. The first ever use of state-sponsored radiological terrorism on this scale would shatter modern notions of homeland security, not just in the Middle East, but across the globe. But if you think that's bad, well, you haven't heard about the part where Iran doesn't even have to smuggle anything anywhere to bring entire nations to their knees. Because next up, we enter the world of invisible warfare, cyberattacks. And trust me, this is where things get truly ugly.
Now let's enter the part of the nightmare you can't see, can't touch, and probably can't even fix without calling your company's one overworked IT guy, cyberwarfare. You see, Iran isn't just sitting on piles of radioactive material. They've also spent years quietly building one of the most aggressive and capable state-sponsored cyber armies outside of the usual suspects like China, Russia, and, let's be honest, some 15-year-old genius in their parents' basement. Iranian cyber units have already demonstrated what they're capable of. They've hacked into Saudi oil facilities, knocking out production and sending oil prices skyrocketing.
They've attacked U.S. banks, Israeli water systems, international shipping companies, even some poorly protected university networks that, frankly, didn't stand a chance. And that's just the stuff we know about. But up until now, most of these attacks were designed to harass, pressure, and send political messages. What happens if Iran decides to take off the gloves? What happens if they stop thinking like hackers and start thinking like warfighters? Let's game it out. Scenario 1. Massive coordinated blackouts across Israel. Not just flickering lights, but entire power grids collapsing. Cities plunged into darkness, water filtration plants offline, hospitals relying on emergency generators that weren't designed to run for weeks. Scenario 2. Targeting air traffic control systems. Planes grounded across Europe and the Middle East. Airports closed. Thousands of flights canceled or rerouted. Global supply chains thrown into chaos, again, as if the world wasn't still traumatized from COVID-19's logistics collapse. Scenario 3. Hitting global financial systems. This one is particularly nasty. Imagine banking networks freezing, ATM systems crashing, credit card payments failing, accounts drained, stock exchanges glitching mid-session, billions, possibly trillions, wiped from global markets overnight. Scenario 4. Direct attacks on critical infrastructure, power plants, oil refineries, nuclear safety systems, telecommunications, hospitals, the kind of stuff that holds modern civilization together while we all pretend it's invincible. And here's the truly diabolical part. Cyber attacks come with built-in plausible deniability. Iran could deny responsibility for every single attack while their proxies, freelancers, and state hackers do the dirty work from bedrooms, basements, and anonymous server farms scattered across the globe. Unlike a missile, there's no radar to track. Unlike a bomb, there's no smoking crater. Just broken systems and furious governments blaming one another, while citizens sit in the dark refreshing Twitter on dead phones. The financial costs? Staggering. The societal panic? Off the charts. International confidence in global infrastructure? Shattered. Trade could freeze. Markets could collapse. Businesses could fold under insurance claims that insurers won't even know how to process. And all of this without a single soldier crossing a single border. This isn't just war, it's systemic collapse. And while the world scrambles to respond, we arrive at the next critical question. What would Israel, the United States, NATO, and the rest of the planet do if Iran unleashed this dual-threat nightmare? Because retaliation wouldn't just be likely, it would be existential. And that's where we'll head next.
All right, let's imagine the moment after the dirty bombs detonate. The power grids go dark, the banks freeze, planes are grounded, and half the planet's population is angrily shaking their useless smartphones. The big question now, how would the world respond? First up, Israel. If Iran actually unleashed dirty bombs or full-scale cyber warfare, Israel's response wouldn't be some carefully worded diplomatic statement. It would be biblical. And not the peaceful, psalm-reading kind of biblical, the Old Testament fire and brimstone, here comes the wrath of God kind. Israel would almost certainly launch immediate counterstrikes, not only targeting what's left of Iran's military infrastructure, but likely moving up the chain to hit political leadership directly. We're talking high-ranking IRGC commanders, government ministers, maybe even the supreme leader's inner circle itself. The gloves would come off completely. Every secret Mossad hit list you've ever heard rumors about? Activated. Next, the United States. While Washington has always tiptoed through Middle Eastern conflicts like a blindfolded man walking across a Lego minefield, this would be different. Once dirty bombs detonate in global cities, and once cyber attacks start hitting American or European financial systems directly, this instantly becomes a national security crisis for the entire Western world. U.S. forces would likely join Israel in launching extensive airstrikes, cyber counterattacks, and perhaps even direct special forces operations. And if American citizens or infrastructure are hit, public pressure would practically demand a full-scale U.S. military intervention. Now, enter NATO. If any NATO member country were struck, say London gets its financial district irradiated, or European air traffic control systems are hacked, Article 5 would be triggered. That's the famous "an attack on one is an attack on all" clause that essentially converts local conflicts into global ones. And let me tell you, Article 5 doesn't get invoked lightly. But once it's invoked, all bets are off. Unfortunately, while NATO rallies, another global institution would immediately grind to a depressing halt: the UN Security Council. The minute the issue gets brought to the table, Russia and China, both permanent members with veto power, would likely block any meaningful coordinated response. Not because they're fans of dirty bombs, but because they have no interest in giving the US and NATO even more justification to act militarily against one of their regional partners. That leaves us with the global oil markets, which by now are likely in full cardiac arrest. The Strait of Hormuz would be threatened. Iranian proxies could harass oil tankers. Even rumors of these attacks would be enough to send oil prices skyrocketing past $200 a barrel. Gas stations around the world would resemble scenes from apocalyptic movies. And don't even get me started on food prices, which are directly tied to energy costs. Civil unrest wouldn't just erupt in the Middle East. You'd see protests, riots, and political instability spreading across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We're no longer talking about a regional war. We're now talking about a global economic and political crisis that could rival or surpass the chaos unleashed by the world wars of the 20th century. And ironically, here's where it gets even twisted. Iran might not survive its own masterstroke. In the next part, we'll explore whether Iran itself could endure the consequences of its own retaliation.
Now, here's where the whole plan starts to resemble a poorly thought-out villain monologue. Because while Iran's leadership might see dirty bombs and cyber warfare as brilliant asymmetric moves, they might also be signing their own regime's death warrant. Let's start with the obvious: domestic backlash. Inside Iran, the economy is already on life support. Years of sanctions, corruption, mismanagement, and skyrocketing inflation have left everyday Iranians frustrated, exhausted, and increasingly vocal. Young people are already protesting. Women are burning hijabs. Dissidents are risking prison and torture to challenge the regime. Now imagine adding to that stew total global isolation, new rounds of crippling sanctions, international condemnation on a level even Russia hasn't yet experienced, and the knowledge that their government's reckless escalation has triggered not just foreign attacks, but potentially full-scale war. Suddenly, the Iranian leadership isn't just fighting Israel, the US, and NATO, they're fighting to survive inside their own country. Regime stability? Let's just say the Ayatollah's inner circle might start looking nervously at the exits. But it doesn't stop there. Regionally, Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi Shia militias, might feel emboldened in the short term, but once Iran itself is under heavy fire, cut off economically, and facing serious regime collapse, those proxies may lose their sugar daddy. Without Tehran's financial, military, and political backing, many of these groups could fracture, weaken, or turn on each other. Meanwhile, Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, who've been cautiously balancing between confrontation and diplomacy with Iran, would almost certainly side with a global coalition aiming to bring stability back to the region, and keep oil money flowing, of course. Even Iran's so-called friends, China and Russia, would suddenly find themselves in a very awkward position. While both nations enjoy poking at Western dominance, neither wants to see global markets collapse or a major war spiral out of control. And both would face serious international pressure to step back, or worse, be seen as complicit in radiological terrorism. In the ultimate irony, Iran's desperate retaliation might accomplish the very thing its enemies have failed to do for decades: unite the world against Tehran. A self-inflicted collapse, brought to you by radioactive dust and hacking skills. And now, as we reach the real nightmare fuel, let's ask the question nobody wants to answer. What if the First World War of the 21st century isn't launched by ICBMs, but by dirty bombs and crashing servers? We'll dive into that terrifying what-if moment in the next part.
All right, now we arrive at the beating heart of today's terrifying scenario, the true what-if moment. Forget the old Cold War fantasies of mushroom clouds rising over cities. Forget grainy black and white footage of nuclear tests with soldiers ducking under desks. That was 20th century apocalypse thinking. This is the 21st century, where war wears a much more sophisticated and sinister face. What if the first true global war of this century isn't triggered by nuclear bombs raining from the sky, but by radiological contamination and digital collapse? Let's break it down. Imagine cities like Tel Aviv, London, or Dubai partially evacuated and cordoned off for years due to dirty bomb contamination. These aren't theoretical fallout zones. These are global business hubs, financial capitals, major logistical arteries. Suddenly, entire sections of the global economy are amputated overnight. Now add to that the invisible chaos of digital warfare. Stock markets freeze and glitch unpredictably. International wire transfers are blocked or rerouted. GPS satellites fail, disrupting everything from cargo shipping to food delivery apps. Hospital systems crash mid-surgery. Air traffic control loses synchronization, grounding planes worldwide. Energy grids fail in domino patterns across multiple continents. It's not just war anymore, it's paralysis. And here's the truly horrifying part. Unlike conventional wars, there's no front line to advance, no army to negotiate with, no treaties to sign. You can't simply retake a server farm or liberate a stock exchange. This is systemic collapse, where confidence evaporates faster than governments can respond, where modern civilization, designed for comfort and efficiency, gets exposed as horrifyingly fragile. And while leaders scramble to patch financial systems, reassure markets, and turn the lights back on, second-order crises erupt, like food shortages as supply chains collapse, civil unrest as unemployment surges, mass migrations as cities become unlivable, populist revolts fueled by fear, conspiracy theories, and governments' inability to control the chaos. And if you think international alliances will hold steady under that pressure, well, history suggests otherwise. In this version of World War III, armies aren't storming beaches, they're destabilizing societies from within. It's not soldiers who dominate, it's coders, hackers, and whoever controls the digital scaffolding propping up modern life. In short, the perfect recipe for global disaster without ever officially declaring war. But before you fully lose sleep, let's step back and look at one final question. Could the world actually prevent this? Are there off-ramps still left before we reach this nightmare? All right. Before we declare humanity completely doomed and go start building bunkers in the backyard, let's ask the only hopeful question left on the table. Can this nightmare actually be prevented? Because as terrifying as dirty bombs and cyber warfare sound, the truth is we're not completely powerless, at least not yet. First, international diplomacy, yes, that tired old tool everyone loves to mock, still holds surprising leverage. Despite all the bluster, even Iran knows that crossing the dirty bomb or major cyber warfare line risks catastrophic blowback, not just militarily, but economically and diplomatically.
China and Russia, two of Iran's few heavyweight friends, do not want to see oil prices skyrocket uncontrollably, global markets freeze, or Middle Eastern shipping lanes collapse. If Tehran starts hinting seriously at using dirty bombs or escalating cyber attacks, you can bet Beijing and Moscow will be on the phone, not out of love, but out of pure self-interest. They want instability, not full-blown meltdown. Second, behind-the-scenes intelligence operations are likely running at full tilt right now. The CIA, Mossad, MI6, and a dozen other shadowy organizations we don't publicly admit exist are undoubtedly working overtime, tracking nuclear material stockpiles, infiltrating cyber units, disrupting smuggling networks, planting malware inside Iranian systems as preemptive sabotage, monitoring proxy groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and various Iraqi militias for signs of radiological ambitions. Every dirty bomb plot disrupted, every malware attack preemptively neutralized buys precious time and hopefully lowers the temperature. Third, military deterrence still matters. The overwhelming military superiority of the US, Israel, and NATO still casts a long shadow. Tehran's leadership knows that unleashing dirty bombs or massive cyber strikes could trigger not just airstrikes, but regime-ending decapitation operations, the kind where very powerful people suddenly find themselves on the wrong end of drone strikes or international arrest warrants. In short, fear of annihilation is still a powerful motivator for restraint. Fourth, there's always internal pressure. The Iranian public may not love Western powers, but most ordinary Iranians definitely don't want to see their country turned into a radioactive wasteland or its economy obliterated even further. Already exhausted from years of sanctions, protests, and repression, a truly reckless escalation could spark mass unrest and weaken the regime from within before foreign missiles ever arrive. And finally, diplomacy isn't dead. It's ugly, messy, and often infuriating, but it works. The back-channel talks in Oman, Switzerland, or wherever diplomats huddle quietly may yet offer off-ramps, small compromises, quiet deals, the kinds of arrangements nobody brags about publicly, but everyone quietly accepts as preferable to global disaster. So yes, this nightmare can still be avoided. But with tensions this high, one miscalculation, one rogue commander, one proxy attack spiraling out of control, and the whole system can tip over like a rickety Jenga tower. Which brings us to the ultimate long-term risk. Even if Iran backs down today, what about tomorrow? What about the precedent this kind of brinkmanship sets for future conflicts? Here we are staring straight into the future. Because even if this specific Iran scenario de-escalates, the ugly truth is that the door has now been cracked open to a much more disturbing kind of warfare that might define the 21st century. Let's call it hybrid apocalypse warfare, where bombs and bullets are no longer the only or even primary weapons. Instead, we're entering an era where smaller states, rogue actors, and even terrorist groups can punch far above their weight using unconventional tools. Radiological contamination that doesn't require sophisticated nuclear weapons. Cyber sabotage that can cripple nations from thousands of miles away. Disinformation campaigns that turn populations against their own leaders without firing a single shot. For Iran, dirty bombs and cyber attacks aren't just desperate moves. They're part of a larger shift in global power dynamics. Because when you can't match your enemies tank for tank or plane for plane, you pivot to attacking their weaknesses, their open financial systems, their interconnected supply chains, their digital dependence on fragile technology, their public's fear of invisible threats. In this new battlefield, airports, hospitals, stock exchanges, water filtration plants, even online banking apps all become military targets. And worse still, this model is incredibly attractive to every other actor on the planet who feels threatened by Western power. North Korea is watching. Pakistan is watching. Even non-state actors like Hezbollah, ISIS, and drug cartels are watching, all realizing they don't need to steal a nuke to destabilize a superpower. They just need a few kilos of radioactive waste and some clever coders. Meanwhile, global defenses remain woefully unprepared. Sure, nations have cyber commands and anti-hacking task forces, but the sheer number of vulnerable entry points, from outdated hospital software to unsecured shipping company servers, is staggering. The modern world wasn't built for resilience. It was built for efficiency. And that efficiency comes at the cost of being terrifyingly brittle. Now imagine trying to build deterrence policies for this world. How do you retaliate against a cyber attack that's traced to 15 proxy servers? How do you prove who smuggled a dirty bomb into a financial district? How do you maintain alliances when countries blame each other for attacks that are technically plausibly deniable? This is the messy, chaotic, trust-eroding future of warfare. And it's not just military planners who are nervous. Insurance companies, logistics firms, international banks, energy suppliers are all starting to realize that their stability depends not just on market forces, but on whether some foreign hacker gets lucky one night. In short, even if we dodge this particular Iran crisis, the world has officially entered a new era where the rules of conflict are being rewritten. Which leaves us with one final question. What happens if Iran crosses this red line anyway?
All right, this is it. The worst-case scenario. The red line is crossed. Iran actually does it. Somewhere in Tel Aviv, or maybe Dubai, or perhaps even London, the first dirty bomb detonates. The initial blast is relatively small, but that was never the point. Radiation spreads. Panic spreads faster. Within hours, entire districts are evacuated. Hospitals overflow, not with radiation burns, but with terrified citizens demanding tests. Every cough becomes a potential symptom. The financial markets spiral into a freefall as stock exchanges close, credit freezes, and insurance companies simply stop answering the phone. At the same time, half a world away, servers crash across banking networks. Flight tracking systems go haywire. Container ships sit frozen outside ports while customs databases reboot, or worse, are corrupted entirely. Power grids flicker and fail in major cities as Iranian cyber units push into water filtration systems, hospital control networks, even military logistics. GPS networks spit out false coordinates, grounding airlines and disrupting emergency responses. Governments scramble, but the response is fragmented. The UN is paralyzed. China and Russia veto any meaningful resolution. NATO convenes emergency meetings as Article 5 looms like a loaded gun on the table. Israel and the United States move quickly and decisively. Airstrikes hammer Iranian infrastructure. Special forces target leadership. But this isn't a tidy surgical operation. Iranian proxies respond with rocket attacks across Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, even Yemen. Oil tankers are struck in the Strait of Hormuz. Global oil prices spike past $250 a barrel. Meanwhile, civil unrest spreads globally as food prices soar, gasoline shortages multiply, and mass protests erupt from Europe to Asia. Social media becomes a digital battlefield of its own, flooded with propaganda, conspiracy theories, and coordinated disinformation campaigns, all designed to pit populations against their own governments. Inside Iran, the regime itself starts to fracture. Economic collapse turns simmering protests into full-blown rebellion. Revolutionary Guard factions turn on one another as regional power struggles erupt inside the collapsing state. China and Russia, sensing disaster, pull back, not out of principle, but out of self-preservation.
they quietly begin securing their own interests while distancing themselves from Tehran's recklessness. And so, in one final twist of irony, Iran's desperate retaliation ultimately triggers the very outcome its leadership always feared most: international isolation, domestic collapse, and the disintegration of its carefully cultivated web of regional influence. What began as a highly calculated move, leveraging unconventional warfare to avoid traditional conflict, has instead ushered in an uncontrollable spiral of chaos, a hybrid world war with no clear front lines, no clear victors, and no exit strategy. This, my friends, is the terrifying future that now hovers in the shadows of today's headlines. And that wraps up today's chilling episode of What If Horizons. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and follow us as we continue to explore the scenarios no one wants to think about, but everyone needs to understand. Next time, we'll take you even deeper into another geopolitical powder keg. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and keep asking, what if?